So I think another topic that I want to hear your guys' thoughts on, that's a little bit more muddy, is development. So looking at kids and thinking about what we do and don't know about strengthening feet and walking barefoot or with minimal shoes or whatever it is. Should we throw kids in Hoka's or other maximalist shoes just as their everyday shoe? Not necessarily talking about running, but I'm talking like my 4-year-old. Should he be wearing these big, cushioned shoes, or should he be in minimalist stuff, and why?
I think it depends what age of child you're talking about. If you're talking about a 4-year-old, absolutely not. They're still developing. You think about just how a child's lower extremity alignment will change from age 4 until age 8. They'll, baby starts out more Jenny Veris, bow-legged, then they progress to knock-kneed, and then eventually by like 7 or 8, kids' lower extremity alignment should be pretty straight. So you certainly wouldn't want to put a kid in a shoe that does not allow for normal ankle and foot motion when walking or running. Why would we want to alter a child's mechanics when their mechanics are still developing and changing? Now, if you're talking about a 16-year-old girl who's at skeletal maturity, that might be a different question, but it also depends, how long has she been, and are we talking about someone who's running cross country or someone who's just walking in Hoka's at school? I think if you're talking about runners, it's a different story because you should be thinking about the development of them as an athlete over their lifespan. I would say that kids should not be wearing shoes that dramatically alter natural lower extremity mechanics when running, meaning they don't need to be running barefoot, but they shouldn't be in a shoe with rockers. They shouldn't be in a shoe with a really thick stack that's going to alter their proprioceptive input. You could or not, they should be in a motion control shoe because, as we know, motion control shoes don't really do what they say that they do. And if you put a child in a motion control shoe, will you be affecting their motor development, their proprioceptive development? So I think that, and of course, the literature about these like middle ground minimal shoes, something like the Kinvara, where there's a little bit of stack, drop is like 4 to 6. They've actually found that those are worse than wearing a minimal shoe or wearing a maximal shoe in terms of plantar pressures and injury rates, but that's like a whole nother podcast, right? But I think in general, my recommendation to a child's parents who the child wants to run and develop as a runner would be to put them in a shoe that allows natural motion, protects the foot, and doesn't alter mechanics at all.
Protecting the foot meaning like from rocks.
Yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Not like a cushion protection. We're talking like literal, you don't want a nail to go into your kid's foot.
Right.
Yeah. I think one thing that's important too is activity, lifestyle, and variation. Because it's one thing if the kid's just walking around in Hoka's all day at school, goes home, sits down and plays video games. It's another if the kid walks around in Hoka's, takes off their takes off their shoe and plays around the grass in the front yard, goes to baseball practice, wears cleats and gets exposure, or soccer practice, practicing lateral movements and higher things. I think having a certain amount of variance in the skills and the activities and the things that you're doing might even be more of a general topic than just the footwear itself. But I agree. I don't think we should be like locking out ankles and decreasing proprioceptive input to the kids. I think that's very important. I'll let Matt go.
I agree with both of you where there is a time and place for each one. I think as you develop, and I am not a pediatric therapist by any stretch. I had the wonderful experience during my last clinical rotation in PT school to work at the Napa Center, which is an amazing neurodevelopmental physical therapy clinic over in Hawthorne, California. Like, shout out the Napa Center. They taught me more than I could ever. It was amazing. But what I learned there and got to talk to them about was this exact topic about what should kids be wearing in terms of the younger ones. When we're talking about like anywhere from 0 up to like 6 to 8, where you're getting those really, like, a lot of development is happening. And I agree with both in that some variety is key, but when it comes to the younger years, there's so much musculoskeletal development happening that less is really more. And there's lots of options now in terms of having a nice wide toe box to let the metatarsals be able to spread out correctly, to allow for proprioceptive input, right? So kids, what's called sensory integration, or being able to tolerate the input from the landing on the ground, like that has to develop too. People assume, oh, the only thing that when my kid is growing up is just their height, their muscles. No, it's your brain going, how do I handle all the things around me? Whether it's socially, there's developmental parts there, emotionally developmental parts, but also sensory wise going, what do all these sensations around me mean? And so the foot and the lower extremity need to be able to integrate these correctly. So at that younger age, I would probably avoid heavily cushioned shoes just for normal development. The body needs to be able to handle a lot of twisting, rotation, side to side movement. That's where your arch develops. So that's important. As you progress past that point, I think now, once you've got the foundation down, variety is key. And I think having several different options is really important. I get messages all the time, both from locally and around the United States, email-wise, people asking, hey, my daughter or son just started cross country and I put them in minimalist shoe and they can't handle they keep getting injured. I'm like, well, have they been physically active? The answer is no. There is a time and a place for a Hoka. It might be better if they don't have very good movement control or shock absorbing ability. And a Hoka initially might be a better shoe for a lot of these kids. In the United States, most of our kids are not very well conditioned, right? Especially compared to other countries. A lot of them are sitting. We drive them everywhere. They don't have to walk. So getting into a high level of physical activity, you might want a shoe that's got a little bit more to it. You're going to want to transition out of that eventually, if possible, because if you're going to wear track spikes or cross-country spikes, you're going to have to get used to that. That's a huge transition. So starting out, a Hoka might be really good, or a maximal shoe might be really good for somebody that's just getting into running. But depending on what you find, you can experiment after that. It's just like anything, transition into these things. So I agree, at the younger age, I think we should keep them out of really restrictive, narrow, high stack or like shoes. But as you get older, you should definitely experiment with that. And now, coming from working with children that may have developmental delays in their musculoskeletal maturity, that's a whole different conversation in terms of posting or orthotics or stuff like that. That's an exception. That's going to be highly individual, and that's a whole nother like series of podcasts and episodes. So that doesn't quite apply for, but those with normal musculoskeletal maturity and normal sensory integration, no initially, and then yes, depending on what they need it for as a tool.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Matt, that like if you're talking about a 13-year-old who decided to join the cross-country team, but previously didn't do much, you have to consider their physical background in shoe recommendation. You definitely can't put them in a minimal shoe. They will absolutely get injured. And that also kind of leads down the path of, well, middle school and high school sports tend to not do a very good job of providing conditioning programs for athletes. They just have them do their sport, but there's no emphasis on all of the additional strength and flexibility work that is necessary for whatever sport you're talking about. And running is a huge example of, you go to cross-country practice, all you do is run. You maybe do some drills. Same thing with track. You probably do some form drills, but they're probably not having strength training sessions unless you have a very good coach or program. But they're missing out on a huge part of these athletes' development.
Yeah.
On a side note, strength training was mentioned. I think that's important at any age. There was a stereotype for a long time that, if my kid picks up a weight, it's going to stunt their growth. That's not been shown. The opposite actually has been shown in terms of facilitating optimal musculoskeletal development and injury prevention. So it is okay for your kids to pick up and be lifting heavy.
Yes.
That's okay. It will probably help them. I would say that's, shout out to all of our high school and middle school gym teachers. Like, they get treated the worst and are honestly one of the most important parts, and gym programs keep getting cut around the country. We need more conditioning, not less, for our kids.
Yeah. And I think, outside of the shoe realm, if any of us could give recommendations to parents or coaches, it would be, make sure your kid isn't specializing in a sport like until they're 18. Maybe that's a little extreme, but 16, like kids, and even the best athletes in their sport were multi-sport athletes and doing lots of different things, because we're talking about footwear, but outside of that, sports specialization early is really rough on kids. So
I should note the ones that have successful long careers tend to be the ones that have a lot of like variety early on. Unfortunately, the ones that tend to specialize early can peak really quick, and then the last part of their career can be a little rough injury wise. It's not everyone, but
or they just get a lot of burnout.
Yeah. We're not even talking about the psychological component. That would be interesting to look at. Somebody knows that. I don't know what that literature is, but I'd be very curious if.
Just read Tiger Woods. Is it the biography on Tiger Woods?
Oh, I've never read that.
I haven't either, but my coworker did, and he told me about some of the crazy stuff that his life entailed.
Oh yeah, same with I think Andre Agassi wrote an autobiography, and he basically hated tennis.
Yep. Wow. Yep. Okay, so we just touched a lot about kids, what it looks like. I think generally the idea of allowing development outside of highly cushioned shoes makes sense from a theory standpoint. There's nothing that necessarily states that wearing a maximal shoe is going to ruin your kid's life, but there's the theory is pretty good there about allowing the foot to develop as your skeleton is developing, getting the proprioceptive input, especially in those younger ages. So but let's transition to the other end of the spectrum, and let's talk about kind of people in the world of not just age, but I'll say 65 and up, but also getting into more of like frail, regardless of age, and changes in that kind of stuff. So what do you guys think in terms of recommendations for people in that spectrum of the world, in terms of should they be using minimalist, should they be using maximalist, why?
It depends.
Yeah, it depends. I think so much of it's individualized. I mean, it comes straight back to how active are they? What is their lifestyle like? Or what are they doing day to day? And what are their needs? I think that's the most important question, because some people might just want something that they can walk on a very flat road on. They do their little mile walk in the morning and they come back, they make their coffee, and then they might do some things throughout the day because they're retired and that's all they want. Some people might want a lot more than that, or vice versa. Like, there's just such a wide spectrum. I think clinically, it's good to take a look at where the impairments are and what you can do to help if they are in the clinic and they're asking that specific question. But a lot of it comes back down to that comfort paradigm of just like, does this shoe work for you? Does it feel good? Does it do everything you need it to do? Because I have some people that, like, trying to think of like a case example. So there was someone who like couldn't stand a high rocker shoe, but they liked having a slightly softer platform underneath them with a more flexible thing. And like the Hoka Hupana was like the gold shoe for them, but they don't run. They walk. It's like a lifestyle shoe, and that's what works for them. And they can do a little bit of everything for them. Whereas some other people have loved the Bondis. They have really stiff ankles and like hips, and like they just like that ability to actually open up their stride again. And that for them, that's all they wanted. Other people, they hate it. It's a very high stack shoe, very stiff, like proprioception's way out of whack. And they might like something more like the Topo ST4, like that I have somewhere. Where is it at? I don't know. It is. but something more low profile where they feel the ground, it has more flexibility, and it's something that they feel more comfortable moving around in. So I think it's just such a wide paradigm, and they are adults and they can make an educated decision on some of this stuff. And I usually just advise that they try a few pairs on, local running store, even REI, like anything, just put more than a few pairs on and see what it feels like and get an idea for what you like.
David, I like what you said about considering the individual and not just lumping everybody into one category based on their age. Around here in Connecticut, many of the orthopedists and podiatrists recommend Hokas to their patients who have any type of ankle stiffness or foot problem, which works for a lot of those people. But then as a therapist, it's important to consider the drawback of their preferred shoe. We know that thicker soled or higher stack shoes reduce proprioceptive input to the foot and ankle. So we might emphasize the importance of balance and proprioceptive exercises to those patients, which we probably are doing anyway, since we know that they have a foot or ankle problem. But it's all about balance, looking at our patients as a whole person and what's going to help them function for the things that they care about the most. If they want to walk, if they want to be able to run, if they like to hike, we've got to figure out the right tools to help them function for their lifestyles.
Totally. I'm going to sneak in and say just a couple tidbits. I think for people who I work with who have significant balance deficits in the kind of forward and back direction, sagittal plane, there are a couple shoes that I think are worth considering not using, because there are some of the design of rockers really, yep, that's one of them. So David just held up the Asics Glide Ride 2. And if you've worn that shoe, you know it has kind of this falling off a cliff feel as you roll forward. And you do have to be able to control that. And then I think the other one that Matt held up earlier for me is the Skechers Go Run Max Road series. And so the Max Road's heel has a really significant bevel that kind of feels like you can fall backwards when you roll onto it. And so if you're somebody who's in a situation where you've had falls in the past and you're looking for a shoe that you're going to use to walk around the house, or if you're a runner to be running in, you know, I would make sure that you try these on before you just go buy them, because you don't want a shoe that you have to control a lot of front and back or sagittal plane motion if you can't handle it. So just, it's worth considering some of those things that don't have flexibility, because there are other more highly stacked shoes that don't have as an extreme of a rocker that's going to push you forward or backward. So
I would totally agree with Nathan on that, you know, I'm a little biased since I tend to do better with a little bit more rocker and with some of my ankle mechanics, especially how stiff my Achilles and calf is. I just need to work a little bit more on that. But again, it's not a one size fits all. So people that have balance deficits, a rocker shoe may not be a good idea. You might want something a little closer to the ground that gives you that input. That's going to help your body go, oh, I know where I am. So, you know, so if you do lose your balance, you might be able to react to that quicker because you've already know where you are. On the other side of that, if you're somebody that doesn't have very good mobility of your foot and ankle, right? So it's really hard to transition over it. A rocker shoe is going to be really, really good because that rocker is going to replace what you're missing. So again, it's not a one size fits all. It's what good things or what deficits do I have? And how do I find a shoe that matches and complements me and helps optimize what I do have as much as possible, while I continue to work on that outside of the shoe.
Yeah, and I agree with everything Matt just said. And just to reinforce that too, I want to just really reiterate too that there's a lot of variance intrinsically within a lot of these companies as well. So it's not as simple as just saying, oh, well, Asics will take care of you here, Saucony will take care of you there. You got stiff ankles, go to Hoka. Well, Hoka does have some pretty flexible and low profile shoes too. I mean, most of their shoes are that high stack rigid rocker, but not all of them are. Because like earlier when I said the Hupana, for the listeners, if you don't know what the Hupana is, it's basically just a lifestyle crossover shoe. It's basically a relatively low profile flexible shoe. So even within companies that are known for a specific thing, they still might have a lot of variance among their own models. So it's even more important to find that shoe that works for you, independent of whatever company it may be.
So variety is good.
So
and getting a good, oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Andrea.
Just emphasizing getting a good shoe fitting is important. I think as clinicians, we probably all have our favorite local running stores that we know do a good job in fitting people and recommending that they go there. We want to help our patients as much as we can, and we want to make sure that we're sending them places that will give them good advice and have good return policies if they get a shoe and it turns out not to work for them.
Totally. So I think, we're going to wrap things up, but I think the overarching theme that you probably have heard every time that we dive into a topic is that things are simple until you start actually thinking about people. And so there are going to be sometimes general recommendations that come out either from us or from random articles you read on the internet, but people make things complicated. And so when it comes to different stages of development, everyone's going to have different needs. When it comes to what these different shoes do, there are going to be benefits and drawbacks of each of them. And, thinking that's what we're hoping to be a resource for everybody in helping you think critically about this. I think it's a fun topic to dive into. We could probably talk about it for another hour, but nobody wants to hear us talk that long. So before I really wrap things up, though, anybody else have anything else before we close?
Mizuno, please bring back the Wave Universe. Thanks.
I guess there's just a lot of variance even amongst certain categories of shoes. So like for the listeners, I just held up a bunch of racing flats. So like low profile road shoes, and you have some like the Asics. What is this one? This is the RP5. Yeah. Very rigid for a cross country / road flat. Or you have something like cruise, relatively flexible, low profile. Same goes for the race. Adidas has always done that torsion system, so theirs is going to be a little bit more rigid as well, but with a flexible forefoot. So just finding what works for you. Because I mean, when you're going into those high school years and you start, if you are going into cross country and track, that's going to come up at some point. So just finding what works for you in terms of that lower profile or racing fit for you.
Yeah.
And then just to add to David's comment, for if you're a high school cross country or track runner and you're wearing spikes for the first time, make sure you give yourself plenty of time to transition into them. Don't let a race be the first time you wear them. Spikes are just like minimal shoes, but they're really stiff. And if you don't transition into them properly, you're going to get hurt.
Yeah, I still have a hard time transitioning into spikes.
I would say, especially now, spikes are getting way more aggressive now that we're starting to see carbon plates in those too. So I've already had, I don't even know how many cross-country athletes I've seen in the last couple of weeks that are just getting back into races. And they did just that, where they haven't worn spikes in a year and a half. And then all of a sudden they're jumping into it. Like we've all been saying, please, if it's really different, you need to transition into it. For those athletes that are like high school, college, cross-country and track, that might mean doing a little bit of your workout in them, wearing them for some strides. For runners that are outside of that, especially older runners, really take your time to transition, especially if you haven't worn something like that since high school. If that was 15, 20 years ago, take your time, please. It'll be well worth it.
Older runner is someone who high school is 20 years ago. Oh, no.
Okay, I should be sorry. Well, it's almost 15 years for me, so I guess I can't say that. Yeah, 30.
Oh boy.